He was moments away from being deported forever when a German shepherd walked into the courtroom wearing the president's dog tag. How did a lost military K9 become his last hope? Here's what happened. But before we get into the story, drop a comment below. Let us know where you're watching from. The room felt like it had forgotten how to breathe. Every pair of eyes locked onto the dog who stood in the center of that sterile, fluorescent-lit space as if he alone commanded the air in everyone's lungs. Armin's heart slammed against his ribs, confusion and disbelief warring against the slow, creeping sense that something monumental was about to unfold. The guards froze in place, one reaching for his radio but unable to tear his gaze away from the glint of silver swinging gently from the dog's collar. President Nathaniel Grant. Those words didn't just carry weight. They crushed the atmosphere like a hammer against thin glass. The dog stood still, rainwater dripping from his thick coat onto the cold concrete floor. His eyes a deep, knowing brown that seemed to pierce right through the walls of every secret Armand had ever buried. His legs trembled, not from fear, but from the realization that whatever fate had brought this animal here now stood between him and the edge of the life he thought was over. A senior agent moved cautiously forward, his fingers shaking as he reached out to steady the dog tag and read it aloud again, as if saying the words one more time might make them make sense. But the room remained locked in that impossible moment, the dog unmoving, the storm outside howling louder against the thin windows as if the world itself had paused to witness this. Armin couldn't tear his gaze away from the dog's eyes. He knew those eyes. Not just from the reports or grainy news photos of the president's legendary canine valor who had gone missing overseas months ago, but from a lifetime ago, a memory buried under sand and smoke and gunfire. Kandahar. The collapsed building. The terrified young boy who had crawled through broken concrete and rebar to free a trapped, injured dog while enemy fire rattled the sky. His own hands raw and bleeding as he tugged at the mangled beams, his breath coming in desperate sobs as he pulled the wounded animal free. And now that same dog stood before him, older, scarred, but unmistakably the same. Armin felt his legs give way, his knees hitting the cold floor with a jolt as the dog moved toward him. Each step slow, deliberate, and filled with a silent recognition that made tears sting at the corners of Armin's eyes. The dog sat before him, lowered his head, and with a single paw reached out to touch Armin's trembling hand, as if to say, "I remember." In that instant, every wall Armin had built around his heart crumbled. Every moment of pain and exile and forgotten sacrifice flooding back in a wave of unbearable emotion. And before anyone in that room could find their voice, before the radios sparked back to life with the chaos of high-level orders and frantic calls to the White House, Armin Navarro knew with absolute certainty that his life was no longer his own to lose. Something far greater was at work now, something that even the most powerful hands in the country couldn't stop. And it had arrived in the form of a soldier who didn't need words to fight for him. Valor had come home, and with him, redemption had walked through the door. Valor didn't move, didn't so much as flinch as the agent's hand trembled against the cool metal of the tag, his voice cracking again when he tried to repeat the words but failed, the gravity of them too heavy to lift twice. The storm outside roared louder, a gust rattling the high windows as if nature itself was pounding against the walls to bear witness to what was unfolding within. The guards exchanged frantic glances, their fingers hovering near holstered weapons out of sheer instinct, but no one made a move. How could they? Valor stood like a monument in the middle of the room, every inch of him radiating the kind of command that no badge or uniform could ever enforce. And then his eyes, deep as forgotten wells, locked onto Armin again, and that unspoken bond, one forged in a war-torn wasteland half a world away, lit up the space between them like a silent explosion. Armin's throat tightened painfully, his hands still cuffed but his heart pounding with the unmistakable rhythm of a moment he thought would never come. Valor took a step forward, his massive paws landing with quiet purpose against the slick floor, the sound echoing louder than the crackle of radios or the frantic whispers rippling across the room. Another step, and another, until the distance between them was gone, and Valor sat directly before him, his head tilted slightly, his breathing slow and even, his entire being focused solely on the man in shackles before him. The senior agent, his face pale and slick with sweat, stumbled back a step as if realizing this was something far beyond his authority, something no manual or protocol had prepared him for. Outside the room, hurried footsteps echoed against the tile floors as more agents arrived, their expressions a mix of panic and awe, their eyes drawn first to the dog and then inevitably to Armin, as if the connection between them was something visible, a chain forged of memory and sacrifice that even the strongest laws could not break. The room seemed to tilt under the weight of that realization. And then the radios flared to life with a single name that crackled over every channel. Valor. We found Valor. And in the same breath, another voice, lower, more urgent, cutting through the static like a knife through fabric. The president wants a live feed, now. Cameras were rushed in, lights flickering on harsh and bright, but Armin saw none of it. He only saw Valor, the soldier who had found his way through miles of unforgiving terrain and impossible odds to stand before him now. And as a young technician connected the live feed and the large screen flickered to life, revealing the unmistakable image of President Nathaniel Grant seated behind the resolute desk, his eyes heavy with concern and something deeper, recognition, Armin felt the world close in around him. The president leaned forward, his gaze locking not just on the camera, but somehow through it, directly at Armin. And then, with a voice that carried both the authority of the nation and the raw weight of personal memory, he spoke the words that would stop time itself. I know that man, and I know exactly what he did for my dog. No one is going anywhere until I get to the bottom of this. And in that moment, the man without a country found his worth written not in papers or policies, but in the unwavering loyalty of a soldier who had no voice yet spoke louder than any courtroom plea ever could. The memory came rushing back with brutal clarity, sharper than the sterile lights above and more deafening than the urgent voices crackling through radios around him. Kandahar wasn't just a place on a map. It was a wound etched into his bones. A place where the sand smelled of smoke and blood, where the nights were so cold it felt like the stars themselves had frozen over. He had been 15 then, barely more than a boy, but already carrying the weight of a lifetime on his narrow shoulders. The refugee camp had been nothing more than a collection of battered tents and shacks hidden beneath the jagged cliffs, a place forgotten by the world, but hunted by men who thrived in the shadows. That night, the sky lit up with tracer fire, the air split by the brutal percussion of mortars and the sharper, colder sound of men screaming. Armin had been helping his mother gather their few belongings when the first explosion hit, sending a shockwave through the ground that knocked him to his knees and tore their fragile shelter apart. Dust choked the air, thick and suffocating, and through the swirling clouds of sand he heard it, a desperate, agonized yelp that cut through the chaos like a knife. Without thinking, his feet had carried him toward the sound, past the crumbling remains of a supply truck and into the heart of the collapsed western wall where a support beam had fallen, trapping something or someone beneath. Crawling through the wreckage, his lungs burning and his fingers raw from pulling twisted metal and broken concrete aside, he finally saw him. A massive German shepherd, his side heaving with each labored breath, his left leg pinned under the collapsed rubble. Blood matted his dark coat, but his eyes, those fierce, intelligent eyes, locked onto Armin's with something that looked dangerously close to human understanding. The gunfire outside grew louder, closer, but Armin couldn't leave him. Not now. With every ounce of strength left in his frail body, he wedged himself deeper into the rubble, ignoring the sharp edges tearing into his skin as he worked the beam loose, inch by inch, even as his vision swam with the edges of unconsciousness. And then, with one final desperate shove, the beam shifted just enough for the dog to crawl free. Armin remembered collapsing beside him, his breath ragged, his hands trembling as the dog pressed his massive head against his chest. A silent gesture of gratitude before disappearing into the smoke-drenched night. That had been the last he saw of him, until today. Now, years later, that same dog sat at his side, older but no less proud, his scarred leg a permanent reminder of the night a boy with nothing had risked everything. And as agents and dignitaries scrambled to rewrite the narrative of a forgotten hero, Armin sat in the middle of it all, his hands unclenched for the first time in years, as if some invisible chain had finally fallen away. And in the stillness between the chaos, he understood. This wasn't just a reunion. This was fate circling, back, demanding that the story unfinished in the sands of Kandahar be written in full before the world. Armin had spent years learning how to disappear, how to shrink his existence down to a shadow cast against the back walls of forgotten kitchens and sun-scorched construction sites where his name was never asked, and his worth was measured only by the sweat on his back and the silence he kept. He learned to move unseen through the alleyways of cities that glittered with the promises of freedom he could never quite touch. His life a delicate balancing act between survival and the crushing weight of invisibility. Every paycheck was slid across a counter with eyes that never met his. Every night spent curled beneath the hollow comfort of a shipping crate or the brittle warmth of a malfunctioning radiator. And through it all, he held his memories like fragile glass, never speaking them aloud, never daring to believe that the sacrifices made in that burning desert meant anything, in a land where paperwork mattered more than character and a signature held more weight than a life saved. But as he sat there now, his wrists still bearing faint red marks from the shackles they had only just removed, he understood that fate had its own language, one that no official record or forgotten case file could ever erase. Valor had remembered, despite the years, despite the continents that stretched between them, despite the government files that reduced Armin to a line of text marked deportable, Valor had found him. And that silent journey, through cities and storms, through the hunger and the search for something lost, meant more than words ever could. Valor was more than a soldier's companion now. He was living proof that even in a world built to forget people like Armin, some bonds refused to be broken, some debts demanded to be repaid. As the chaos of the holding facility swirled around them, as agents barked into radios and high-ranking officials hurried through the doors with their polished shoes and uneasy expressions, Armin stayed locked in that impossible moment, his fingers brushing against the cold metal of the dog tag still hanging from Valor's thick neck. The inscription burned into his mind. Nathaniel Grant, Commander-in-Chief. A name that held the weight of the most powerful man in the world. Yet here it was, delivered by a dog who crossed every border no wall could hold back. And as the television screens mounted high on the walls flickered to life, broadcasting breaking news alerts that painted Armin's face beside Valor's with headlines reading "Mystery Hero Identified in Presidential K-9's Rescue," he felt the old fear rise up, that instinct to run, to vanish before the spotlight turned brutal. But then Valor pressed his head against Armin's leg, that simple, wordless reminder that running wasn't the answer anymore. It never had been. The world had tried to forget him, but today, in this place, before cameras and presidents and the heavy hand of justice itself, Armin Navarro was about to be seen. And this time, there would be no turning back. The West Wing had not known such a storm since the early days of Grant's presidency. But this wasn't a diplomatic crisis or a military standoff. It was something far more personal, a reckoning that no line of protocol could contain. President Nathaniel Grant stood in the center of the Situation Room, the low hum of classified briefings fading into nothing as his sharp eyes locked onto the monitor displaying a frozen image, one captured from a grainy field camera long dismissed and buried deep in the archives. It was a boy. Dust-caked skin, a tattered scarf wrapped clumsily around his face, eyes burning with defiance as he pulled with trembling arms against a fallen steel beam, freeing a bloodied German shepherd from the wreckage of a bombed-out supply post. And that dog, unmistakable even through the scratches and blood-matted fur, was Valor. The room had fallen silent as the president pressed his palm flat against the edge of the screen, his jaw clenched so tight it ached. "Find him," he ordered, his voice low but charged with a weight that made every man and woman in the room stand straighter. "I don't want theories. I want names. I want facts. And I want to know why the boy who saved my dog is sitting in a detention center like a criminal while we debate policy over humanity." The orders moved faster than sound after that. Files once locked behind layers of red tape were ripped open, classified documents decrypted and pored over by agents working through the night. And through it all, President Grant remained in his office, pacing beneath the portraits of former leaders, his mind circling back to the memory of the mission Valor had disappeared on. A covert humanitarian. Operation meant to stabilize a forgotten pocket of Kandahar's war-torn outskirts, one that ended in disaster and was quickly swept from public consciousness. But here it was again, resurfacing not as a political scandal, but as something profoundly human. A bond between a boy who had nothing and a dog that had lost everything. And now, those two stood at the center of the world's attention. As dawn broke and sunlight spilled through the frosted windows of the Oval Office, the final report landed on his desk. The boy's name wasn't a mystery anymore. Armand Navarro. No criminal history, no violent offenses. Only a paper trail of struggle, backbreaking labor under false names, wages withheld, nights spent on concrete floors in forgotten corners of a country built on the promises he was never allowed to claim. The president sat heavily behind his desk, his fingers brushing the well-worn tag still dangling from Valor's chain, now displayed on the polished oak before him like a reminder of the debt he never repaid. And for the first time in years, Nathaniel Grant didn't think about polls or political fallout. He thought about the boy who had given everything without asking for a thing in return. With a heavy breath, he reached for the phone, his voice carrying across the line with the full weight of command and something far deeper. "Tell them," he said, his eyes locked on the flag outside his window. "I'm going to bear witness to this myself. Clear my schedule. I'm going to meet the man who saved my dog. And my conscience." And just like that, the course of a forgotten life changed forever. The room held its collective breath, as if time itself had bowed in deference to the moment unfolding before it. The sharp click of the president's polished shoes against the marble floor echoed like a drumbeat of history in the making, each step cutting through the thick tension that blanketed the air. Armand could barely believe the scene before him, the leader of the free world standing not behind a podium or a wall of security, but right here, inches away, eyes locked with his in a way that felt less like a political statement and more like a man remembering a debt written in blood and loyalty. Valor sat motionless at Armand's side, his head held high, his dark eyes unwavering, his scarred leg resting neatly beneath him as if he understood that this was his moment too. A silent soldier, standing guard over the man who had once freed him from a cage of rubble and death. President Grant's voice, when it came, was steady but thick with emotion, the kind of raw sincerity that could neither be rehearsed nor forgotten. "I never forget those who protect what I love," he said again, his hand reaching down to rest lightly on Valor's massive head before turning his full attention back to Armand. "You saved my friend." His voice cracked ever so slightly, that thin line between a leader's composure and a man's gratitude fraying just at the edges. Now I will save you. For a long, breathless moment, no one in that courtroom moved. The judge, hands frozen above the bench. The rows of spectators, eyes wide, some biting their lips to hold back tears, others openly letting them fall. Cameras clicked in rapid bursts as journalists scrambled to capture the raw humanity playing out before them, knowing this was no longer just a court case. It was history unfolding in real time. Armin swallowed hard, his throat tight, the weight of every sleepless night, every moment spent wondering if he even existed in the eyes of a country he had bled for, all crashing over him in a single tidal wave of disbelief. He tried to speak, but no words came. Only a trembling exhale as his gaze dropped to Valor, whose silent presence gave him strength when his own failed. President Grant reached into his coat and drew out a crisp, folded document, its edges marked with the presidential seal, the ink still fresh as he laid it before the judge's bench. "Effective immediately," he announced with the full authority of his office, "Armand Navarro is granted full citizenship under executive order. His acts of valor have earned him not just the right to stay, but the honor of belonging to the very nation he already served better than most." A collective gasp rippled through the room as the judge, her voice thick with emotion, officially recorded the decree. And as the final stroke of the pen sealed Armin's fate, the silent courtroom erupted into a standing ovation. Veterans stood at attention, civilians wiped their eyes, and somewhere in the back, a young boy pressed his face against his mother's shoulder, his voice a soft whisper that carried further than he knew. "That's what a real hero looks like, Mama." And for the first time in his life, Armin Navarro stood tall, not as a man, running from shadows, but as a name that would never be forgotten. The weight of the dog tag in Armin's palm felt heavier than any chain he had ever worn, yet for the first time in his life, it wasn't a burden, but a symbol of something he'd never dared believe he could claim: belonging. His fingers closed around the cold metal, the inscription pressed against his calloused skin as the last echoes of the gavel faded into a silence far louder than any applause. In that moment, with the president's words still hanging between them like a vow sealed by history itself, Armin Navarro straightened his spine, his shoulders no longer bent beneath the invisible weight of a life spent unseen. The cameras flashed in a frenzy, their lenses capturing the precise second a forgotten man became a living testament to everything this country claimed to stand for but had so often failed to uphold. President Grant remained before him, his eyes not those of a politician seeking a headline, but a soldier recognizing another who had endured the battlefields of life far from the glory of medals and parades. "You earned this," the president said quietly, his voice roughened by the weight of the moment. "Not today, not just here in this courtroom, but on that night when no one was watching, when you risked everything to save a life simply because it was the right thing to do. That's the kind of heroism that defines a nation." Armin's chest tightened, his heart pounding against the walls of a body that had known too many years of fear and silence. He opened his hand slowly, staring down at the tag, the president's name gleaming beneath the harsh courtroom lights. And for the first time, his mind didn't spiral into plans of escape or the bitter resignation of survival. He felt stillness, real and profound, the kind that comes when a man finally sees himself not through the lens of others' judgment, but through the hard, unshakable truth of his own worth. Valor, as if sensing the shift, pressed his massive head gently against Armin's thigh, his dark eyes rising to meet his with a look so familiar, so filled with quiet understanding, that a fresh wave of emotion threatened to break loose. But Armin swallowed hard, refusing to let the tears fall here, not now. Instead, he lifted his chin, his eyes scanning the crowd of onlookers, faces filled with awe, veterans saluting, children staring wide-eyed at the man who had once been nothing more than a shadow slipping through the margins of their city streets. And in that sea of strangers, Armin stood tall, his name now spoken not with suspicion but with reverence, his dignity restored not by the cold ink of a signature but by the undeniable truth that sometimes, against every impossible odd, justice finds its way home. As President Grant stepped back, the two men shared a final nod, an unspoken promise that this moment was not the end of the story, but the beginning of a legacy built on courage, sacrifice, and the enduring power of doing what's right when no one is watching. And in the hush that followed, with the weight of the dog tag still in his hand and the eyes of a nation upon him, Armin Navarro finally, irrevocably belonged. The cameras never seemed to stop rolling, their lenses capturing every moment as if the world feared missing even a second of the living proof that courage didn't wear uniforms alone. It walked in silence, worked unnoticed, and sometimes sat quietly beside a war-scarred dog under the glare of 1,000 lights. Armin Navarro had become a symbol, not by choice, but by the undeniable truth of what he had lived through. And as the days turned into weeks, his story carved itself into the fabric of a nation desperate to believe in something pure again. Valor was always by his side, the silent guardian whose presence reminded everyone that loyalty was not bound by borders or language, but by actions taken in the darkest moments when no one else dared to step forward. Together, they sat through interview after interview, their bond as unshakable as the day Valor had found Armand in that detention center, the world watching as a forgotten man and a lost soldier found their way back to each other. News anchors stumbled over their words, their voices cracking as they read letters from veterans who wrote in by the thousands, some who had stood on foreign soil and knew what it meant to owe your life to a hand that reached through fire and fear. Children drew pictures of valor, their crayon sketches of the heroic dog pinned to the windows of schools and libraries, their innocence embracing a hero they could understand, a dog who had walked through war and still chose kindness. Across the country, candles flickered against the night, lines of flame stretching like rivers of light outside. Courthouses and city halls, each flame a silent promise that the forgotten would be remembered, that every nameless soul who had sacrificed without recognition would one day stand in the light. Armin had walked through that ocean of candlelight more than once, his footsteps slow, his eyes scanning the faces of strangers who nodded at him with a reverence usually reserved for legends. And though he wore no medals on his chest, no ribbons pinned to his jacket, the weight of those candles felt heavier than any military honor, because each flame wasn't just for him. It was for every man and woman who had stood at the edge of belonging and dared to hold on. Valor stayed close during those walks, his steps perfectly in sync, his scarred leg a reminder of the night that had shaped both their lives. And though the cameras captured the sweeping images of hope and redemption, it was in the quiet moments when the crowds faded and the lights dimmed that Armin understood the true depth of what had happened. He had been seen, truly seen, not just by a nation, but by the soul of a country that had almost forgotten how to look back and find its lost sons. And as long as Valor walked beside him, he knew that this new chapter of his life was not about fame, but about making sure no one else ever had to fight so hard just to be acknowledged. The sun rose slowly over the marble columns of the Capitol, painting the sky in soft shades of gold and crimson as the American flag lifted in the morning breeze, snapping against the dawn like a heartbeat returning to life. The air carried the faint scent of fresh-cut grass and polished stone, but beneath it lingered something heavier, something that settled deep in the chest. The weight of sacrifice, of lives lived in silence and service without the expectation of reward. Armin stood motionless among the rows of decorated veterans, his newly pressed suit still feeling foreign against his skin, the Navy cross pinned to his chest catching the early light and gleaming like a forgotten star brought back into the night sky. His fingers brushed against it absently, not to admire the medal, but to remind himself that it was real, that everything leading to this moment had not been a dream clawed together by a desperate mind longing for a place to call home. Valor sat beside him, his broad chest rising and falling in steady rhythm, his ears alert, his sharp eyes moving slowly across the gathering crowds with the calm precision of a soldier who had seen too much but still stood watch. The scar along his leg was barely visible beneath the crisp fabric of the ceremonial harness, but to those who knew, to those who understood, it was as much a badge of honor as the silver cross resting against Armand's chest. The band struck the first notes of the anthem, the sound swelling through the Capitol steps and rolling out over the sea of people gathered below. Their faces lifted, their hands pressed over their hearts, their voices trembling as they sang a song that, for the first time in years, felt like a promise kept instead of a promise broken. And in that moment, as the anthem rose higher, as the flag snapped proudly against the morning wind, Armin felt something rise in him too, something that had lain dormant under years of struggle and survival, something that now stood tall and unyielding beside the soldiers who had welcomed him as a brother, not by birthright, but by the unshakable truth of sacrifice. President Grant stood at the podium, his voice steady as he addressed the nation, his words carrying across the stone steps and through the waiting hearts of every citizen who watched from home or stood shoulder to shoulder beneath the open sky. He spoke not just of Armand, but of every unseen hero who had given their courage quietly, in the dark corners of the world where no camera dared to follow. And as the final lines of the anthem echoed into silence, the honor guard raised their rifles for a final salute, the sharp crack of the 21-gun salute cutting through the air like a promise written in thunder and smoke. Armin stood taller, his shoulders squared, his eyes fixed on the horizon where the sun burned brighter than it had in years. And as valor pressed against his side, steady and unflinching, Armand knew with absolute certainty that this wasn't the end of his story. It was the legacy of every forgotten soul rising with him, carried forward by the loyalty of a soldier's heart and a dog who had never once left his side. The morning air was crisp, the kind that hinted at the coming winter, but held just enough warmth to remind the world that the fight for hope was never fully lost. Leaves drifted lazily from the tall oaks lining the White House lawn, their amber and gold colors fluttering down like a silent salute to everything that had come before. Armin Navarro stood at the edge of the south lawn, his hands folded behind his back, his chest rising and falling slowly as his eyes swept across the field where a new generation of service dogs moved in perfect sync with their trainers. He stood taller now, not because of the medals pinned to his chest or the executive title etched on the door of his office, but because the weight that had once pressed his shoulders toward the ground had long since lifted, replaced by purpose, by belonging, by a life finally lived in the light. At his side, valor moved carefully, each step slower than the last year, but just as proud. His once sleek muzzle now dusted with silver, his powerful frame leaner but no less dignified. His ears twitched at the sounds of young dogs barking and their handlers calling out commands. But his eyes remained sharp, scanning the perimeter with that instinctive vigilance that no age could dull. Together, they walked the path between the past and the future, their shadows stretching across the grass like a bridge between what was and what could still be. Armin watched as one young shepherd broke free from the training line, bounding toward them with a puppy's reckless enthusiasm, its oversized paws thudding against the earth as it skidded to a stop just inches from Valor. For a brief moment, Valor lowered his head, his nose brushing gently against the younger dog's muzzle. A quiet transfer of wisdom in a language no human ear could fully understand. Armin knelt beside him, his fingers brushing through the silvered fur along Valor's neck, his throat tightening as he felt the slow, steady thrum of that indomitable heart still beating strong after all these years. The wind stirred through the trees, rustling the leaves overhead, and for a moment, it felt like the earth itself paused to listen. Armin closed his eyes, his lips barely moving as he whispered the words that had become his personal vow. Carved from years of hardship and sealed in a bond that nothing, not even time, could break. No one gets left behind. And in the stillness that followed, carried on the soft wind that wound through the trees and across the open field, a single bark rang out, strong and clear, not from valor but from the future standing just beyond the horizon. Armin opened his eyes and smiled, his hand resting over his heart as the young dog bounded back to its handler, full of life, full of promise. Beside him, Valor sat tall against the rising sun, his eyes bright, his head high, a living legend whose story would echo long after the final chapter had closed. And as they stood together, man and dog, bound by a loyalty forged in fire and redemption, the promise was clear. The world may try to forget its forgotten souls, but as long as even one voice remained to carry that promise forward, no one would ever truly be left behind again.